Hello, everyone. Welcome to another conversation on the Practical Extremists. I have an awesome guest today. We have Rich Smith, a poet, journalist, and as I understand it, professional Bernie Sanders impersonator. Is this allegation true or?
Well, Ethan, I would be lying if I said I didn't have uh, a Bernie Sanders impersonation,
Oh
but
man.
have not been paid to do only the impersonation. You understand?
Oh,
So
okay.
I do have one, but to say I'm a professional, that's maybe a bridge too far.
More of a hobby.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Well, I really was excited that we're going to have this conversation because you've been reporting on all of the protests and the police brutality in response to the protests, and as
Sure.
well as uh, the CHOP, formerly known as the Chaz. Um, you have an article that's titled "An Exceedingly Chill Day at the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone." And in it, you write the difference between representations of Chaz in conservative media and the reality on the ground couldn't be more stark. So I was hoping, could you, like, for the people who didn't get a firsthand account of what happened at the autonomous zone? Like, what went down over there?
Well, the zone arose out of 10 days of protests at the corner of 11th and Pine in Seattle, about a block away from the East Precinct. And the protests were initially inspired by the killing of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis. Um, but then during the course of that 10-day period, the cops, kind of kettled that group at 11th and Pine, kind of controversially because you're not supposed to kettle a group of people like that in the middle of a pandemic, uh, nor is it best practices for handling protests like that, which was a lesson that came from the WTO protests, which also ended in a lot of tear gas and police brutality. So it's not funny that a similar situation occurred in Seattle, 10 years later, but I guess history rhymes in that way. In any event, there was a sort of a transfer of grievance between the anger and frustration at George Floyd to the Seattle Police Department, the National Guard, who had spent 4 or 5 of those 10 days gassing the crowd pretty heavily. And then the police uh, one day left the area, abandoned the precinct, and let the protesters march after a lot of pushback from city officials and the city in general. And so after the police abandoned the precinct, we still don't know whose call that was, whether it was the mayor's or the police chief, Carmen Best's. They point to a low-level commander, but don't say who. Anyway, after they left the precinct, the protesters suddenly found themselves having to defend from attacks from white supremacists, attacks from anybody who wants to make the protesters look bad, a precinct that they didn't care much about. And so the precinct became the kind of epicenter of what was first called Free Capitol Hill, and then morphed into Chaz, and then into Chop. It, I don't know really. I think the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, that language autonomous zone, came from the anarchist world, anarchist philosophy, and maybe also from the Occupy movement a little bit. But you know, the that language, the Chaz autonomous zone, set off a bell in the minds of suburban right wing nut jobs that was amplified by the president and by Fox News and the whole right wing conservative media power structure. And that phrase autonomous zone made the protesters seem framed the protesters as separatists trying to create their own country within Seattle, and so those people thought that they needed to defend the country from these anarchist separatists who were ceding land, Seattle USA land in Seattle, and so they uh, you know that only increased the fear on the ground of attacks from white supremacists and other right wing extremists, um, and so while that was happening in conservative media, that sort of fear that there was a group of armed guards shaking down local business owners and residents for money and IDing them or whatever to get into the zone. Uh, what we saw at the time was budding mutual aid organizations that had sprung out of the original protests themselves. While the protesters were there at 11th and Pine, um, arts led for the most part, or artist led for the most part, mutual aid groups sprang up around local businesses, passed out granola bars, water bottles, first aid, stuff like that. And those kind of formalized into a little small town where there was a no cop co-op and a garden in the nearby park, Cal Anderson Park, and speakers circle where little temporary councils would convene and talk, chop shop, and conversation cafes, and a sort of flourishing of, hey, let's talk about what defund means, like what defund the police means, what demilitarize the police means. Let's talk about race, and so that during that day, the first 3 days or 4 days, it really was um, mostly that, which reflected a sort of a moment in the 10-day protest. For 3 or 4 days in the middle of the 10-day protest, there really was a lot of like musicians coming through and rappers coming through and artists coming through. And there was even the martial law band had set up a stage about a block away and they were playing during the protests. And it sort of was humorously called the Capitol Hill Block Party. Every year we have a block party on Capitol Hill. And so, so yeah, so that kind of arts and music and educational work was kind of happening during the protests themselves, and that carried through at the beginning of Chaz or Chop.
Yeah, that was. I mean, I remember it was reported that like a meme had started somehow the idea, but it seemed like from your reporting, it was much more organic than that. And you have one article where you talk about it's a June 5th article, the Vermilion Art Gallery and Bar, the Rancho Bravo, Blue Cone Studios, Bang Seattle. These are all like mutual aid organizations that the CHOP sort of stemmed from. Is that how to?
Yeah, well, I mean, from the, those businesses were, the pandemic had stopped their business, so they weren't doing anything. But the people who run those businesses are in the neighborhoods, and they were part of the protests. And some of the people who worked in those businesses or owned those businesses were supportive of the protests, while the cops were, gassing their neighbors, and their customers, and so they allowed their businesses to be used as kind of hubs. I know in Vermilion Art Gallery that was used as it started out kind of as the medics hub and a food distribution hub. Ended up collecting a lot of food and water. And then the Rancho Bravo patio, that's where one medic station was. And the volunteer medics, it was all really just whoever wanted to help out helped out. They ranged from from people with first aid and CPR experience to doctors, depending on the day. A lot of nurses. I think one story I remember hearing was a nurse tried to. There was a protester who had got hit by a flashbang or a blast ball that the cops had thrown, and a nurse ran in and tried to gather that person, get them out of the way, and the cops threw a flashbang at the nurse who was trying to get the person out of danger, and the next day, like 8 nurses came back. So like the brutality from the cops helped kind of activate people to the cause of these mutual aid stations.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then some of those people carried on into CHOP and health, but a lot of it also is just that's in terms of the mutual aid groups who are around, but the core groups of protesters shifted.
Hmm. Sure. Yeah, so you reported almost every day on the protests. Yeah, can we talk a bit about that? So, am I right to say that you were tear gassed at one point?
At several points, sure. I
Seven
mean,
points. Could you describe sort of like the sensation of being tear gassed?
well, let's see. Uh, I was I we were filming and reporting from the strangers' offices, the strangers in newspaper where I work, and we got the second and third floor of a building that overlooks that intersection where cops and protesters had faced off, and so when the cops started tear gassing, they would throw their canisters, light up the middle of the intersection, and all of that gas would waft up into the through our windows and fill our offices.
Mm.
And so that was maybe 2 or 3 of the days, and then another day I was on the ground and I was following the protesters on the ground, and cops had ordered a dispersal of that intersection, and so people went into the nearby park, and the cops were throwing. At that point, it was OC gas, I guess, which is pepper spray in a grenade form. That feels a lot like tear gas. What happens is your eyes start watering. You kind of double over. Your air passages feel attacked, and you can't breathe very
Right.
well. And
Yeah.
you want to get out. Like you need to get you have to find some clear air, and you're just. I mean, what do they call it? Like it was like lacrimal excretion or something, or excretion. You're just pouring from every
Mm.
orifice in your face, and you're doubled over, and you got to get some fresh air. It's very painful.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned in one of your articles that the Times reports that there's virtually no difference between CS gas and OC gas. But it's the case that the SWAT team is authorized to use CS gas, but there were cases where that wasn't what was happening. The police were continuing to use, or were alleged to be using CS gas despite not having proper authorization. Is that correct?
Yeah. So they can use, but on May 29th, which was the day of the protests downtown, when that was like sort of first big major protest downtown, and they used tear gas, CS gas, OC gas, and pepper spray on that day, and they can use it. The Washington State Patrol can use it, SPD could use it, but there had been uh, a couple things happened, and now I can't remember the exact order. So hopefully you can bear with me. But there was a oh, okay, I remember. The mayor. The first thing that happened after several days of gassing, either of CS gas or OC gas. depending on the day. Um, the mayor said that they would quote unquote ban tear gas. But really, what they did was say that only the SWAT team can use tear gas, and anybody can use tear gas so long as Carmen Best, the police chief, orders them to. And then they said they would only use it if it was in a life threatening situation. But all they have to do to say that there's a life threatening situation is to say that, glass bottles and rocks are being thrown at the cops. And so, we're going to use tear gas. So there was the mayor sort of in a PR move to try to get the people on her side in a very lawyerly way, attempted to restrict some use of tear gas, but that didn't last long.
Hmm. I mean, some of the stuff that you've been reporting on as well is you actively talking about the curfew, but also that body cams were not always known to be on, and you also mentioned that you attempted to go into the CHOP, and one of the sergeants refused to let you in, and as well as a cameraman whose name I have written down here somewhere I can't find, whose office is in the what was once the autonomous zone, was given a final warning to stop taking pictures. Um, how effective do you think these sorts of measures have been in concealing what the police have been doing? Do you think that there's much coverage of what's going on outside of the Stranger or outside of independent media? Like another case would be when that you also reported on when a child was pepper sprayed, the man who filmed it was arrested for allegedly having a laser pointer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I could take it one at a time. The body cam stuff. The cops. The policy was not to have your body cams on if you're a police officer covering working a protest, because it was like, the ACLU suggested that um, you would be filming people expressing their first right, their First Amendment right, and so it was sort of a protective measure. Protesters didn't want the fact that they were used as or protesters didn't want the fact that they had protested to be used against them if the police released this camera footage, and it turned out that somebody's employer doesn't like the Black Lives Matter or whatever. So it was a kind of to protect First Amendment rights is why they didn't have the body cams on. So they say, but that's that changed later on with local policies. In terms of, or it was sort of legislated away. It became one of the central requests of the protesters. In terms of uh, the not being able to get into the CHOP after it was cleared. I mean, so for about a week, the CHOP or the Chaz was, yeah, a block party that was fun, and people were hanging out, and it was a mixture of active protesting to bring change to the way that the city runs its police department. The demands were to free all protesters like Evan Herrera, who had been arrested for allegedly shining a laser light at a cop. He denies it. And defund the police by 50%, and to invest those funds in the black community, in the Seattle's black communities. Those were the three core things that everybody was talking about all the time. And it's unsustainable to just be constantly protesting all of the time. And so they had these breakout sessions, they had these moments of fun and revelry, to sort of recharge and stuff. But then the shooting started happening, and it became a sort of public safety issue, a pretty severe public safety issue that the protesters couldn't control. Seattle, for a long time, has had shooting, a gun violence problem that the police have have not done um, as much as they could to snuff out. Local politicians have not done as much as they could to address, and so that sort of flamed up in the CHOP, and a lot of people who were organizing there, the barrier sentinels and the security group in the CHOP, and the art co-ops and other mutual aid groups. After that started happening, kind of pulled out once guns basically flooded the area. Then it became unsafe, uh, and at the same time, police were promising not to go into the zone because of or to address safety concerns or to address calls in the zone unless it was a life-threatening situation. And even then, with the shootings, um, they didn't do much to de-escalate situations, gun violence situations that were happening inside of the CHOP. And the Seattle Fire Department and the ambulances also weren't connecting very well with the protesters. They had rendezvous points where victims were supposed to meet victims, um, and the ambulances weren't there at the rendezvous points, and so people started having to just basically drive victims to the hospital themselves, which ended up being quicker anyway. But in any event, that became the trying to figure out public safety concerns within that 4 or 5 block radius ended up coming to a head, and the mayor ordered she signed at night an executive order for cops to sweep the CHOP and hold a 10-day quote unquote reasonable perimeter around the area, and keep that perimeter for 10 days. The protesters have derisively named the new CHOP the pork CHOP because of the police presence there. And the day that they swept the CHOP, they tore up tents where homeless people were in, threw them in the garbage, made 30 some odd arrests. And I was trying to get to my office building, which was in the middle of the zone, right by where the protests were happening on 11th and Pine, about a block away from the East Precinct. And a police officer said that I couldn't go in there because the mayor's executive order said that people couldn't be in there while they were clearing the CHOP. To my knowledge, I think I could have got in, and in fact, 15 minutes later, they relaxed their perimeter around the park, and I sort of snuck back into the office and was able to blog from there. But yes, Omari Salisbury, who is a citizen journalist of Converge Media, one of the many, or one of the, who is he has just been he and his media group have been the go-to CHOP media since day zero, as they would say, or since the protest began. He has been covering. He's Converge has been around for a little while, but it really flourished in these conditions under Omari's incredible endurance, resilience, and just skill as a broadcast reporter. It's been incredible to watch him work, and he has basically been running the game, and everybody else is a falling off of the first light of his reporting. He's almost always there live streaming. There's some other people, Future Crystals, one of the people who was hit by the car recently was also a live streamer. Love Diaz, I think, was her name, or their name, and so yes, those kinds of journalists, live streamers of varying like devotion levels. Omari's out there every day. Not all of the live streamers are out there every day. Have really flourished and sprung up as a result of these protests, and have been just doing remarkable work that everybody is just trying to keep up with. The Seattle Times, other sort of legacy newspapers, are doing okay work. Still struggling with the, they're a legacy conservative newspaper, and so their framework, they think that objective journalism just means repeating whatever the cops say as the official record, and so they struggle with with that narrative. Broadcast journalists obviously work within the genre expectations there of being ambulance chasers, basically trying to affirm the ideological worldview of 40 something mothers of two in the suburbs, and they have a simpatico relationship with law enforcement officers because that's who their tipsters are. That's that's where the relation they've built up a lot of relationships and uncritical relationships. National media, CNN and NBC, they've been here and they do what national cable and network groups do. They helicopter in, they take a few shots and leave. Although with the exception of I can't remember her name. She was an NBC reporter who got actually a flashbang thrown at her on live camera, and she's been doing okay work. But there's been remarkable photojournalism too, not necessarily attached to these papers, but sometimes attached to the papers. I'll finish off this long rant, if you'll forgive me, by saying that during the protests and during CHOP, the Stranger's Office, with its proximity, sort of became a kind of journalism co-op. We had photographers and writers from Reuters, the New York Times, AP, the Seattle Times, and all of the radio stations, the KUOW, its NPR affiliate, KNKX, other sort of public radio journalists in and out of the building, using our windows to take photographs and hanging off of fire escapes and just kind of having a place where they could kind of headquarter while they were there, and that having that proximity and that kind of camaraderie was cool, and it allowed more outlets, particularly newspaper outlets and radio outlets, to tell the story a little bit better than they could, which was good whenever that guy Nicholas Fernandez, who's alleged to have driven his car into the protesters on I can't remember the date, but I think it was Sunday, and he shot one of the protesters who tried to stop the car and then ran to the cop line and was apprehended. All of that.
Yeah, June 7th.
Yeah, June 7th. Yeah. So all of the we don't have as good as cameras as the Reuters people and the Times people, and so they were there with their cameras and they could catch every second of that altercation, and it was I was glad they were there. So that's kind of been the media response.
Sure. Yeah. I definitely want to come back to what you were saying about the gun violence, but continuing on the media, I mean, The Stranger and your work and the work of others that I've been reading, it sort of does challenge, I think, the standard framework of objectivity. I think at one point when you were talking about the Asians for Black Lives Matter, and there's a helicopter, and you said in it that the helicopter refused to shut the fuck up. I mean, this is an anarchist YouTube page, big fans of Noam Chomsky's on my shirt. His essay, Objectivity and a Liberal Scholarship, sort of breaks down how objectivity is just the dominant narrative, and in that way, isn't objectivity at all. To what extent, is the way you write consciously challenging that paradigm, or is it just sort of what comes out of you when you write your articles?
I'm aware of that, as I'm aware broadly of the conversations about objectivity in journalism and how that's how that's expressed so often, especially in broadcast news. Objectivity is expressed as just saying both sides,
Right.
and so often they say both sides, but they give one side more credulity than the other, and that's how you know what their quote unquote bias is, or slant. But then, of course, there's how you frame the story in the first place. For instance, you could have we've had a homeless crisis here for like any other major city in the course of the last 10 years, and the Seattle Times will run a story about business owners in an industrial district who are pissed off at the homeless people who live in RVs nearby, and are befouling their area, or whatever. And so the Times will write a piece, and from the perspective, quoting a bunch of business owners clearly mad, making them seem sympathetic, and then they'll throw in a couple of quotes from some homeless service providers for both sides, and then it'll seem fair to the outside observer, but just because everybody was given a voice. They might even go so far as to quote a homeless person who lives in an RV nearby, just to give the full story. But the choice to privilege the business owner's perspective and to write as if they were the victims in that scenario would not even that was not an objective stance, or not essentially a subjective perspective that the objective reporter was covering. That I don't think that crosses the mind of your of some of those journalists at these larger newspapers who think that they're doing quote unquote objective journalism. What I try to do in my writing is I'm very interested in the facts, and so I want to make sure that the facts of the stuff that I'm writing about are solid. That if they are not solid, that I flag them as unverified, or rumor, or non-rumor, and maintain skepticism of those with the monopoly on violence, which is the state, and those who can abuse power in a systemic way, and those who can legally lie, as the cops can legally lie, as we tragically saw an example of that, I think last year or 2 years ago, where a Seattle police officer, I want to say, lied and told a suspect that they had actually killed somebody in a car wreck. That suspect didn't actually, to get a confession out of them, that suspect didn't actually kill somebody, but was so moved, was so sad that they had killed somebody, that they killed themselves, that they committed suicide. And so, I just and growing up in communities where the cops and politicians lie all the time, like that, anybody gives official statements from state groups, uh, uh, like automatic pass, as if that's just the capital T truth, is mind-boggling to me. And so I just try to bring some skepticism to those statements that I get from those groups, and then just by merely not framing protesters as violent criminal extremists who want to kill everybody. Yeah, by taking seriously their claims and not immediately dismissing them as broken children looking for a home, or whatever. That ends up producing my perspectives. But I guess the shorter version is to of the kind of journalism that I do is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. That general ideology is kind of guides my sympathies, at least. That said, I'm not, I'm I'm not above criticizing protesters or criticizing the subaltern or whatever if they're wrong or and so or if they say something. I'm skeptical of them too. I'm just not dismissive.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Um, a lot of people were, I think, what wanted to turn towards sort of like conspiracy theory mindset when it came out that the man who uh, drove the car through the crowd and shot someone and then ran behind the police lines, it turns out he allegedly has a brother who works in the East Precinct.
Yeah.
That was something you had reported that he had said. Whether there was some like greater conspiracy that we don't know about yet, I've heard a lot of sentiment is that there's people are upset with the way in which the white supremacists who have been coming into Seattle have been treated by the police as compared to the protesters. And yesterday, I was on the ground while it was all happening. Proud Boys came in and they went through the chop zone where like 2 days ago someone was like bum rushed for putting 1 foot past. They were spraying pepper spray and all these things, and none of them got arrested. Only the counter protesters had been arrested. Do you think that there is a bias by the police in regards to these two groups and how they react to these two groups?
I don't know that those people were Proud Boys, but they were certainly MAGA hat like Trumpy people. I don't know. I just didn't see them in those polos that you always see Proud Boys in. And we had Proud Boys come several times through the chop while it was still active. But yeah, certainly a bunch of. I saw a group of 10 to 15 MAGA hats with Trump flags, and some of them armed and with those what are they called, Gaddis flags, the "Don't Tread on Me" flags. They came through. I didn't. I only saw a few video tweets of interactions between the cops and those two protesters. You know, it's thinking back. So I'm not quite sure. What that I could use those examples as to justify some argument that there's an affinity between cops and these white gangs, or largely white gangs, or these nationalist groups. But we, before the chop, we had several protests at the State House in Olympia, and those people were heavily armed. They were mad that the governor had shut down the economy, and they were all up in the cops' face, spitting in the middle of a pandemic. And the cops were sitting there, not in riot gear. They were, just taking it, and there weren't as many arrests, and there didn't seem to be that kind of animosity from the chops or from the cops toward those protesters. Whereas also at the State House, I think back in January, if not maybe December, there was a Native American protesters who wanted the governor to. They were I can't protectors of Puget Sound is who I think they're called, and they wanted the governor to create a climate crisis, or to establish a climate emergency, a climate state of emergency, and swear off all fossil fuel expansion projects. We've got a couple of natural gas plants that may go online sometime soon. And they set up these tarpees, is what they call them. Teepees made of tarp, with a platform on top where they sit, and they drum, and they protest, and they occupy the area. And the cops in riot gear, middle of the night, swoop in, tear down the tarpees, arrest people. There is generally, I would say that it's fair to say that the response to right wing protesters by the cops is a little bit more sympathetic than left wing protests, whether it's indigenous activists or whether it is Black Lives Matter activists in Capitol Hill, a majority of whom, it shouldn't go without saying, are white.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of coming to a close, you have you you wrote a poem called "This Was Years Before the Branding of American Fascism,"
Oh yeah.
which I'm not a professional poet, but it seems like what you're saying in it, you're talking about the sort of the dying of art with modernity is not the dismantling of chop sort of like the concrete manifestation of that. Like when I read that, I was like, this is like brutally relevant, it feels like. Or do you think, like one of the protesters that you quote in a couple of your articles, that the chop was an idea and that it will continue and that the momentum has not stopped?
That's such an interesting question. Such a good question. I mean, to the state's relationship to art in general in this case is interesting. They use it as a kind of olive branch. Like they promise to preserve the BLM mural on the street, and they take photos every chance they get of them being very nice to all the art, and by taking down the little plywood around the cement barriers and promising to put it in a museum or do something nice with it. And so that they're using art in this way. If I'm looking at analyzing this from a PR perspective, they're using art as a way of perpetuating a narrative that they've had from the beginning of good protests and bad protests. And so art in this case falls into the activity of good protester, whereas bad protester is somebody who is lights a cop car on fire, or breaks a window, or does something like that, throws a plastic bottle or whatever. And if only we had good protesters, none of this badness would have happened. So that's how I see art being used in this way. And I'm sorry, what was your second question?
As far as like the chop being idea as opposed to place. Yeah.
Very much is. I think that the line that you'll hear from a lot of protesters now is we didn't even want the precinct, like we didn't even want to be there. Though of course once they had it, it became what they thought of as what they must have thought of as a bargaining chip to get their policies passed. That that is the freeing of all protesters, to get their demands met. But they've swept CHOP, and the protesters still don't. So CHOP is definitely at this point more of an idea, and one of the more interesting, and I think, or at least from my perspective, more effective or affecting, if not effective, protests or tactics that they're using is taking the protests and going into neighborhoods full of rich white people who don't normally see these kinds of protests, or who participate in these protests on their own terms. There's like a big protest for a big women's march or a big Black Lives Matter march that's silent and that's sanctioned and that has a path, that ordained by the city, and so people will go and march in that. But they don't have it come to their door on a Saturday and then a Sunday and then a Monday and then a Tuesday. They don't have their gates spray painted. They don't have that shit up in their nice suburban enclaves within the city. And so that, to the extent that so that happened during the CHOP, but people, leaders like Nikita Oliver, sort of did that initially, and that's still kind of that practice is flourishing. And so I think that's kind of where we are now. Although with the recent, they were also in the highway, obviously, last 19 days. Though with the recent vehicular slaughter there, they don't seem to be doing that.
Mm. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess, yeah, the last thing would be, is there anything you want to, well, you can find Rich Smith's work at thestranger.com. And your website, I believe, is Rich Smith Poems?
RichSmithPoetry.com. Yeah.
Rich, RichSmithPoetry.com. Thank you. Sorry about that. Is there anything else you want to plug, or? Anything like that?
Just the slog. That's the Stranger's blog. It's called Slog, and that's where most of the action happens. So just keep your eyes glued to the slog, and sign up for all of our mailing lists. And I guess you can follow me on Twitter. It's Rich Smith, and there's just three S's in there. So it's RISC or RICHSSSMIT.
And there will be a link to that in the description of this video as well, and to all of it. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. I think a lot of people could benefit from everything that you said today, so appreciate it.